You want Chicago's classic hits? Turn to 94.7 WLS for traffic and weather info. Tune into 890 AM WLS for traffic and weather first on the fives when you need it most.
On a Takeover Tuesday, thanks to our friends at College of Illinois, which is interesting. We get all this wide swath of time and ability to be flexible in terms of what we're doing and make pivots. I just want to follow before we get to our next issue. I want to make the point that the cab guy that we were just talking to, who would like to unionize the cab drivers here in Chicago, he's a taxi driver himself. I liked when he laughed. Was like, is that it? It was like we undertipped him.
It was just like having an experience with a cab driver. I hope you don't want to pay with a credit card to get that a lot. Even and if you better have exact change, because all I got is 20s. They yell at you when you get in the cab a lot. You're not using a credit card, are you?
Oh man.
Okay. That's it.
Quite a moment.
You keep that change.
Quite a moment. Well, if there is a unionization, you would think that those kinds of issues would be well addressed, would increase the reliability and I say this all laughingly, increase reliability and consistency and quality, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, one of the reasons why we're calling the Uber is it's sometimes, the cabbies, they got the light on, but they got people in the cabs, or they ignore us, or they're not around. And I never thought I'd hear anybody say that New York City cab drivers are going to be the role model for any situation whatsoever.
Right. Except perhaps some sort of international insurgency. Speaking of international insurgency,
Segue.
Our next topic on the 2 o'clock wheel o' topics is, of all things, Ukraine.
Oh, boy.
This is an interesting situation. If you've been watching the story over the last 2 weeks, the fire has started again in Ukraine. And the real question is that country falling into a civil war, or at least into a partition that will give Mother Russia the ability to control basically the most important parts of Ukraine in terms of international commerce, which are their pipeline exits and their ports. And what does this mean for all the rest of the non-freezing ports in the former Soviet Empire? Jillian Melchior, writer for National Review, is standing by, and she just got back from Ukraine, where you were talking to these people day in and day out, and put yourself right on the ground and right in the middle of this thing. So let's start with the first question. Do you think this is going to descend into a civil war?
Well, a civil war is an interesting way of phrasing it. I mean, I think what's going on right now is Russia's claiming territory. It's annexing territory. It's trying to do what it did in Crimea out in the east. Now, one of the things that I noticed when I was on the ground is that Russian propaganda has been very effective in branding this as a civil war. But if you look at the actual sociological studies that have taken place throughout this, it shows that even in the eastern regions of Ukraine, where there's a higher population of Russian heritage people, Russian speakers, still support for remaining part of Ukraine rather than being part of Russia is around 68%. It's just that the Russian separatists, which are probably backed by Russian military troops, are incredibly vocal and have done a really good job of stealing the spotlight. So do I think there's the possibility for conflict? Absolutely. But whether we can classify that as civil war, I think, is something entirely different.
What do you think that is, then?
What was that?
What do you think that is, then? What is the entirely different thing?
I think the entirely different thing is that Russia's claiming territory. It's trying to do what it did in Crimea. You've got a country that, under Vladimir Putin, is basically acting like Imperial or Soviet Russia, marching across another country and claiming what it will. We've seen that certainly in Crimea, and I think we're seeing that in the east.
But that appears to be the case here, right? I mean, that's really what's afoot here. You think?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I definitely think so.
And how much of Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian nationalism and pride and all of that is going to oppose that? I mean, let's just go back to, Prague. Let's go back to the 1950s and 1960s when the tanks rolled. Do you think that there will be a resistance?
I think there's going to be a strong resistance, and it's not only going to be a military resistance. I mean, if you look at the statistics right now, the Ukrainian troops are really outnumbered. There are 4 times as many Russian soldiers as Ukrainian soldiers. Russia has a military budget that's more than 48 times bigger than Ukraine's. But what I think is you really see Ukrainians united and galvanized. And that's happened in part because of the Maidan Revolution, which overthrew the dictatorial President Yanukovych. They've dealt with that domestic threat very efficiently. I think they're trying to move on to nation building, but Putin's plowing in just at that time that nation building has begun, really destabilizing the country. But I think that because I have that experience under their belt, patriotism is high. I spoke to a lot of people who told me that they want to fight and defend their country. And I think in addition to the military, which might be weak but willing to fight, there's going to be a lot of civilian support for resisting Ukraine. I mean, I met with a girl who was 19 years old in the Ukrainian Revolution at Maidan. She made Molotov cocktails to use as self-defense against Yanukovych's troops who were firing into the peaceful protesters. She's willing to resurrect those skills. So while Russia may be able to claim territory, I think they're going to have a pretty tough time holding it because a lot of citizens don't want that.
All right. And what about this anti-Semitic literature that was being disseminated in some of the towns in eastern Ukraine? That there were guys who claimed to be from the local militias who were handing out flyers that were asking people coming out of synagogues during the Passover festivities, during the Passover services, the people that were leaving that to then immediately go to the town hall and register. And if they don't register, then there would be deportation and confiscation of their stuff. Does that seem to be officially sanctioned by anybody, or are these just splinter groups trying to intimidate?
You know, I think that's a really complicated story. So the report came out about it. John Kerry commented on it. But I still don't really think that we know who these posters came from. It's possible that it was Russian-backed insurgents that are trying to claim part of the country for Russia, making people register. It's also possible that it's corrupt local officials that were trying to make $50 a pop on Ukraine's Jewish population through corruption. I mean, it is the most corrupt nation in Europe. And it's also possible that this was a Ukrainian counter-propaganda attempt to galvanize support against Russia. We don't really know. But what I think is so important about this story, if it is Russian insurgents, is that through the entire Maidan Revolution, you have Russia propaganda pushing out that the Ukrainian revolution is backed by nationalists, fascists, neo-Nazis, anti-Semites. And if it is in fact true that Russian separatists are asking Jews to register, I think that really underlines the hypocrisy and the propaganda. Because when I was in Kiev, I couldn't find any pro-Ukrainian people who are anti-Semitic or neo-Nazi. I met people who were patriotic and wanted to defend their country.
So, I mean, so it's unclear which side these guys would actually be on. This may be an attempt by the Russians to try to create a smokescreen here against the Ukrainian insurgents.
You know, I'm not really, nobody is really quite clear on what exactly the story is or whether or not it's true, but I think it's really interesting, especially in the context of the propaganda wars that have been going on.
Yeah. All right, Jillian, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Jillian Melchior from National Review, just coming back from Ukraine.
Notice how the brave, intrepid foreign correspondent didn't say, "That's it," at the end of the interview. She understood.
Yeah, we
understands diplomacy.
why? Because we tipped her properly.